world, what to speak of the next world? I'll give you an example. In the revealed scripture, it has been mentioned that we should eat enough to maintain our body and soul together. It means eating is for self-preservation, for keeping our body and soul together so that we can serve God. We should eat so much. Now what happens when we break this law of scripture? And most of us do it to some extent or the other. When we break the law of scripture which says we should eat enough to keep body and soul together, what happens? We put on weight. When we put on weight and we become grossly obese and overweight, we develop heart disease and we develop hypertension and we develop diabetes. Then what happens? Then the doctor comes and tells us. The doctor tells us that, my dear sir or dear madam, now you have to confine yourself to a 900 calorie diet. You have to give up salt because you got hypertension. You have to give up sugar and sweets because you got diabetes. You have to give up this and this and this and this, and you have to confine yourself to eating only a small amount. So either you follow the laws of God voluntarily, or you break the laws of God, and then material nature will catch you by the scruff of the neck and force you to follow those laws. So either you study the scripture and in knowledge you follow the laws of scripture, otherwise material nature will catch you by the scruff of your neck in the form of your doctor or whatever else and force you to follow those same laws. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita it has been mentioned that dharma aviruddho kamosmi, that Krishna says, I am that sex life which is not contrary to religious principles. So what do we mean by sex life not contrary to religious principles? By sex life not contrary to religious principles, we mean that sex life which is for the procreation of children whom we want to raise as God-conscious individuals in society. So this is the meaning of sex life according to religious principles. And since time immemorial, God has restricted sex life by this device which is known as pregnancy. People have always been afraid to have unrestricted sex life because they thought that it will lead to pregnancy. They will have to be responsible. They will have to take responsibility along with their sex life. But in the 1960s, something unique and strange happened in the field of human history. And in the 1960s, they came out with a new invention, only so big. And this new invention, which is only so big, it changed the sexual life of the Western world. And that was the contraceptive pill. The contraceptive pill was the first device which gave you 100% protection against pregnancy. So now, as a result of science being used to break the laws of God, you had contraceptive device which would protect you 100% against pregnancy. What happened as a result of that? Actually, it was like thumbing your nose at God or sticking your tongue out at God. You think you're very smart? You're trying to restrict my sex life? Now see, I am so smart, I am so intelligent. Now I have developed a device by which I can have sex life unrestrictedly. So what happened as a result of that? As a result of that, the sexual revolution overtook the Western world. And when you had a sexual revolution that overtook the Western world, a lot of things happened at the same time. First of all, quite understandably, there was an increase in venereal disease, or there was an increase in sexually transmitted disease. But of course, people thought that, so what? We will have better and better antibiotics. Actually, in the olden days, if you got syphilis, the treatment was by taking mercurial salt lifelong. If you got syphilis, there was no instant cure. You had to take mercurial salts lifelong. Therefore, they used to say, one moment with Venus and a lifetime with Mercury. But as the scientists came forward, they came up with penicillin. They came up with better and better antibiotics. They thought they will be able to control venereal disease. I remember my friend in medical college, he wanted to go to America, so he wanted to give his ECSMG examination. And it was only possible for him to give it outside the country, so he decided to go to Singapore. So when I saw his ticket, I saw that his ticket had a 3-night stopover at Bangkok. So I said, just a minute, are you going to give an exam, or are you going for rest and recreation to the rest and recreation center of the world? Please don't stop over at Bangkok, kindly go directly to Singapore, give your exam and come back. So he said, don't give me lectures on morality. I believe in testing everything out myself. If I don't try out everything, how will I know what to avoid in future? He wanted to try everything out himself. In fact, it has been said that an intelligent man, he learns by hearing. A less intelligent man, he learns by seeing. The fool, he wants to experiment himself. So he came back from his ECFMG exam. And when he came back, he came running to me and he said that, look, I'm in serious trouble. I said, what's the serious trouble? He said, I have pus discharging from my urethra. So I took him to the hospital and we had a prosthetic massage done, and the pus that came out from his urethra, we cultured it. And when we got this culture examination done for sensitivity to antibiotics, we found that this organism was resistant to all antibiotics. There was no antibiotic which could act on this organism. So what happens? Every time we scientists think that we'll get a better antibiotic, God, He plays the dice one more roll and He gives a more complex organism which is even more difficult or resistant to those antibiotics. But even then, man doesn't give up. He struggles again to break the rules of God. And he came up with newer and newer antibiotics. Then what did God do? Now He sent the viral diseases. The next roll of the dice was the viral diseases. He sent herpes genitalis. So this herpes disease being caused by a virus, it does not come under control with any antibiotic. There's nothing you can do. It's a lifelong painful condition. And I remember a patient who had come to me with this disease. He was a shippy. And they say that a sailor has a wife at every port. This is what he was trying to tell me. He said, well, you know, they say a sailor has a wife at every port. That's how I got the disease from one of my wives. So I tried to explain to him. I said, why are you going to take such risks? Why do you take such risks with your life? You've landed up with a condition which is going to give you pain lifelong. So he started giving me a lecture on philosophy. He said, Doc, a little pleasure, a little pain, that's what life is all about. You should understand, you know. So I've had a little pleasure, now I'll have a little pain. That's what my life is all about. So man is not discouraged. Even if you give him conditions which give him lifelong pain, he's not discouraged. He tries to philosophize about it. So God actually is very kind. When you break the laws of God, He tries to warn you in a gentle manner. When you don't respond to His gentle nudge, He tries to be a little more firm with you. When you neglect His firmness, then He has to be harsh with you. So then God, He rolled the last roll of the dice. And what came up this time? You got the AIDS virus. In New York, I remember reading a news report about the Manhattan office Christmas parties in New York. It seems that in Manhattan they have an office Christmas party, which is usually held about 3 days before the regular Christmas parties. And in this office Christmas party in Manhattan, everybody uses it to diffuse all the sexual tensions that have been building up through the whole year. That means they use it to have sexual orgies in that office Christmas party. Everybody has sex with everyone and everything and everywhere. Under the table, in the closets, behind the doors, on top of the doors, wherever. In fact, it has been said that the office Christmas party in Manhattan is the greatest thing since Sodom and Gomorrah, which were the original cities of sin. But that year, when AIDS hit New York, there were 14,000 people in the island of Manhattan alone. Just in Manhattan alone, there were 14,000 people walking around with the ability to give you AIDS. So as the New York Times reported, this year's office Christmas parties at Manhattan, everybody in the office Christmas parties at Manhattan sat down with their legs crossed. Nobody wanted to take the risk. So what happens? You try to break the laws of God, but when you try to break the laws of God, what happens? In the end, you are forced to follow the laws of God. But you have to pay if you do not follow the laws of God voluntarily. In fact, it has been predicted that by the year 2000 AD, 20% of America will be either suffering from AIDS or being an AIDS carrier. 20% of the United States of America. Just imagine 1/5 of that continent, of that great nation. So in fact, God, as I pointed out, gives you His laws so that you can avoid unhappiness and hardship in this world. And if you break these laws, then the laws of God are so harsh that eventually you have to suffer and pay. Now you might say that, oh, what's the use in talking about AIDS and the sexual revolution in the West? We are sitting in Bombay city where we have got, thank God, good cultural values, and we never think of having office Christmas parties like this. I have never heard of an office Christmas party in Bombay like this. So why is he giving us a lecture on this? But don't miss the point. The point I am trying to bring about is that sex life according to religious principles, as mentioned in the scripture, is sex life for the sake of procreation of children who will be made God conscious. That means restriction of sex life even within marriage. If you break that law, even within marriage you have to pay for it. Because the laws of God act at a gross level, they also act at a subtle level. Now what do I mean by acting at a gross level and at a subtle level? At a gross level they may act in the form of venereal disease. At a subtle level they act in the form of destroyed human relationships. In the United States of America, 60% of all marriages break up. That means if you get married in America, your chances are more than half your chances are that your marriage will go bust. That means 60% of all marriages in America, they end up in the divorce court. Why is it that this happens? Why is it that this happens? In fact, what to speak of the 60% that do break up? Even in the 40% that do not break up, you have 80% of the men who remain married and 60% of the women who remain married. They have extramarital sexual experiences. This is a result of a recent survey. That not only do 60% of the marriages break up, but also among the 40% that do not break up, 80% of the men and 60% of the women have extramarital sexual experiences. This is because this is the effect of God's laws acting at a subtle level. What happens is that when you have unrestricted sex life even in marriage, what happens is that sex life quickly becomes the center of married life. In fact, there was a famous marriage counselor who said that when a marriage is on the rocks are in the bed. Why did he say when marriage is on the rocks are in the bed? Because the bed becomes the focal point of the marriage. In actual fact, people, according to scripture, people do not get married to have unrestricted sex life. Marriage, according to the scripture, is that two people come together so that they can together pursue a life of God consciousness. They can work towards self-realization together as companions in self-realization, as companions in God consciousness. Not for having unrestricted sex life. But if they have unrestricted sex life, what happens is that sex life, being the highest material pleasure that is available, it quickly becomes the focal point of their marriage. And in a short time, what happens? It becomes boring. When it becomes boring with the same partner, they begin to look outside. When they begin to look outside, what happens is that you get extramarital sexual experiences. So you might say, no, this doesn't happen in India. Please read the India Today 2 issues back. It's about the sexual liberation of the Indian woman. It says very clearly that more and more women in cities in India are actually having extramarital relationships because the entire society